you here to the Thursdays at 4 series. Every Thursday afternoon during the regular academic year, we have an interesting event here at the IAS. If you are not a regular and would like to become one, there's an email sign-up sheet just outside the door that you can sign up, and you'll get a weekly listserv announcement. I'm very happy to welcome Randel Hanson, and actually very grateful that Randel Hanson is here. Maggie Adamek, who was going to give this talk, had to leave town. And fortunately, before she told me that she'd talked to Randel and he'd agreed to come and talk in her place. So it was a change of plan rather than a catastrophe for us. I heard not only from Maggie but from several other people that in fact he is indeed a worthy substitute. He's a professor of geography who will begin teaching at the University of Minnesota Duluth in the spring. Although you've been there for about a year now already as a telecommuting. So you chose to spend a winter in Duluth while you were officially in Arizona, and you're a geographer. He's an expert on food systems planning and food shed analysis. He's a leader in local food issues in Duluth, and he will be convening a Superior Grown Food Summit. If anyone is interested, we have plenty of postcards up here. It will be Saturday, November 14th in the Kirby Ballroom of the University of Minnesota Duluth campus. He's spearheading curricular and research initiatives around sustainable agriculture at the Duluth campus, including the uses of the former Northeast Agricultural Extension Farm and using orchard and historical records as a laboratory for teaching and learning about food systems past, present, and future. He has a book in press called, or almost in press, a book in progress called From Bad to Goods, Marketing Nuclear Waste to American Indians. And anytime anyone sends me a CV, they're kind of putting themselves at risk for what I will say. You won one of an award called the Devil's Advocate Award for outstanding contribution to student life at ASU in 2004. And I think that winning a Devil's Advocate Award is a quite commendable thing. So without further ado, I will turn the floor and the screen over to you.
Thank you, Ann. Well, like Ann said, my name is Randy Hanson, and I've been teaching at Rice University and Arizona State University for the last about 10, 12 years. And my family and I made a decision to sort of move back home, which is difficult as academics because you don't get to choose where you live, you follow jobs. And this took us several years to do, but we have happily made our home in beautiful Duluth and are enjoying that. I'm pinch hitting, as Ann said, for Maggie Adamek today, who you may know is an accomplished person in a variety of fields, but she's doing a lot of work in sustainable agriculture activities here on campus and around the state and really around the country. And I'm not promising to fill her shoes, but hopefully what I'm going to talk about will be resonant with what she would have presented. My primary research for early on, at least, and continuing, was on nuclear waste issues. And in particular, I was focused on how American Indian tribal communities had been impacted by our great nuclear experiment, and also then following up on that, how the government was marketing nuclear waste to American Indian communities as economic development, a great kind of neoliberal process that we concocted in the early 90s, one which failed but was really traumatic for a lot of people involved with that. I taught that those issues a lot, the conflicts and the kind of interminable problems around nuclear waste. And students really began to turn off and really kind of communicate to me that this was a real downer. And can you talk about something that's about, good things and environmental and social solutions? And I was kind of led and nudged by earnestness and optimism and the openness of students into thinking about that and trying to figure out how I intersected with that. And so ASU was going through a period where they were investing massive amounts of money into sustainability, rhetoric at least, as well as some practice, and trying to figure out with both hands what sustainability meant. And I had been a long-term gardener, a serious gardener. And after my teenage sons were born, I spent, we as a family committed to feeding them well from our gardens. And so I had, in Arizona, created this kind of permaculture plot on a 2-lot space with citrus grove and deciduous fruit grove. We had chickens, we had a couple geese named Thanksgiving and Christmas. They never got eaten then, but it was this kind of feedback loop that we created around for the plants and the animals and the human animals. And so I started using that space as a kind of teaching laboratory for students to engage them about issues of environmentalism and food production and so forth. And it was really a kind of interesting thing for me, and students were really into it. And so I took this and ran with it for the last 5-6 years, creating coursework around this, as well as a bunch of community projects in Arizona, setting up CSAs with faculty and staff and students, as well as working with faculty and staff and students and sort of the grounds people and the dining service people, and trying to figure out ways that we could close the loop at the university system there and really use the food that was grown there, because if you've been on the Arizona State University campus, it's really a botanical garden, a historical one that sort of maps the different settler society fantasies about what could be grown there. And so there's olive trees, there's eucalyptus trees for that phase, but there's a lot of fig trees and citrus trees and kumquats, and so and students were very interested in doing this, and it was a way to help them understand the kind of organic machine that the university also was, and also sort of close that loop. And so one of the courses that I worked with was on food issues, and I created this assignment, and I just want to talk about it for a minute, because I think if the metric is mutual learning, it's probably the best one I could ever create. To begin with, I had the students record a food diary as soon as they walked in for the first week, without talking about sort of food issues to clue them into how I was going to trick them, but to really record what exactly they were eating, who they ate it with, why they chose what they did, and sort of a short reflection about whether this was a typical day or not. And they did that for a week. And then we started down the road of looking at the social, political, economic aspects of our food system. And then at the mid-semester point, I asked them to interview their parents, as well as their grandparents, or someone of that generation, and talk about what food was like when that generation was in their 20s. And then at the end of the semester, they had to take these diaries and these interviews as primary data and correlate that with their kind of structural analysis of what we went through, and write some kind of reflective and analytical essay about food in their world. And it was great. It was great for me to read those things, because there were all kinds of interesting self-observations that people were wrestling with about their experiences with food. And even though I knew this intellectually, I was always astounded by the kind of sense of people being de-skilled in food, about less than a few percent of them had actually grown anything, and most people don't know how to think about a system that produces food. And I know in Minnesota that's probably different because everybody's above average. But this was the case with students in Minnesota, or rather in Arizona. And what I realized is that we don't have the kind of skills to make the choices and decisions that are really crucial for ourselves in terms of food choices, because food is the most intimate relationship with nature that we have. I mean, air may be more intimate, but food, through the fuel that is food, we literally recreate ourselves over different periods of time. And what we ingest remakes our bodies over time, many times over throughout the course of our lives. And we thought about that, and we understood, I think, the kind of food systems that we are engaged in. I think, it would really set us back. Simply put, I found that a lot of the students and many knew food through as something that comes between plastic and styrofoam, right? And many of them recorded in their diaries that Boston Market was a home-cooked meal, and that Wendy's wasn't really fast food. And almost all of the students were shocked at their diets at the semester's end when they had to review them to write an analytical paper about this. And I begin my talk today with this story because I think it illustrates a number of discoveries for me, how quickly our food system has changed, how fundamentally it has changed, how little we understand about it as a citizenry, and how powerless many of us feel about changing it. Over the course of 2 short generations, 40 years, we have shifted in the U.S. from a food system that was largely regional and local to one that is global and industrial. Yes, I am aware that food globalization has gone on for hundreds, if not thousands of years, but nonetheless, there has been a categorical shift over the last 30, 40 years that is undeniable, that has reshaped how we eat, what we eat, and so forth in a way that is very profound and with which we have to reckon fairly soon. And I want to talk a little bit about that. For me, this had another kind of personal dimension beyond this because I was one of the kind of agricultural refugees. I grew up on a farm and was part of a system that edged out the kind of farming that my family had done. And in the mid-'60s, if you didn't sort of upsize in equipment, land, machinery, petrochemicals, etc., there was no way economically that you could do this. In addition, in the area that I grew up, there was massive raising of hills and draining of waterways and so forth, so that the machinery could have a nicer time going through. And this was a kind of amazing thing for me to come back to and learn about sort of this world that I was projected out of, the world that I literally recreated my body in many times over, and the one that now I was trying to think analytically about and engage people about. And so this was a kind of very interesting learning experience for me. I'm talking about a conventional food system, and I'll get to that in a second. But you guys are aware, everybody, perhaps many people, that there's something abuzz in our world right now. We don't quite know what it is, and we're searching for it, but it's something around what we call sustainability. And it's really a question. Can what we have created be sustained? What can be sustained? Who can help sustain it? And to whose ends? Those are questions that are being asked in many, many domains right now. And for good reasons, because there's many trends that are sort of chugging along that are going to meet over the course of our lifetimes, which will make us sort of reckon with this change whether we wish to or not. And so this is something that, as this diagram I think illustrates, is a project that demands the full range of knowledge systems. Humanities, social sciences, natural sciences, heritage knowledge, old-timers knowledge, et cetera, traditional ecological systems that will help inform us what and how we can begin to create systems that can be sustained. We're all around this, right? And we're kind of figuring out to what extent we can get to that center. There's a variety of ways that you can approach this idea of sustainability, and the natural step, which is a method that is very interesting for a lot of reasons, its origins among them, but it's a Swedish kind of invention that is being used in a lot of places around the country, particularly in this region and in Canada, Australia, and so forth. But it's an attempt to kind of create a social process by which communities can come together and talk about how they get to being sustainable. And it's usually kind of talked about in 4 quadrants: housing, transportation, energy, and food. And so food is one of these really categorical things that is central to the sustainability project. So when people talk about food systems, right? When people talk about food as part of food systems, they're talking about a process, right? It includes all the processes involved in feeding a population, growing, harvesting, processing, packaging, transporting, marketing, consuming, marketing, etc., disposal. It also includes, or doesn't include a D, all inputs needed and outputs generated at each of these steps. It operates within and is influenced by social, political, economic, and environmental contexts, and it requires human resources that provide labor, research, and education. There's a lot of ways that you can think about representing food systems, and that is not, of course, an insignificant issue. How do you represent these visually and in linguistics? But I'm just going to put this out here as a heuristic device. It's useful to an extent, and it ends its usefulness at other points. But in certain respects, we have a kind of a food system that is dominated by an industrial system whose values of production, efficiency, and economies of scale is the same as those that have operated in car production or any other aspect of our industrial system and have been put into motion by capitalist countries, socialist countries, communist countries, and so forth. We fought a Cold War for a long time, but we shared our love of the industrial system. And so when we're talking about the industrial system, some people call this conventional food, global industrial food system, et cetera, those are conversations that could be interesting. I'm just going to go with this. And on the other hand, we have something called local sustainable systems, which is a very large, again, and encompassing category, a rather default one at this point that could include all sorts of traditional systems, as well as contemporary food systems that are organized around sustainable means and ends, whether intentional or not. And what I want to do is talk and sort of, we meet in the middle here, right? We are the experimental subjects of this system, and we basically enjoy its fruits. And so I want to talk first briefly about the industrial food system and then come back to the other one that we are trying to create. So when we think of this, it's useful to think about a life cycle, which is to say a cradle-to-cradle situation. Because one of the things, of course, we realized over the last decade or two that we probably knew all along but didn't really care about is that we all live downstream from everybody else. And so understanding that the life cycle is a kind of closed-loop system and none of this is outside of us or the system itself. And so on the one hand, you have the origin of resource in this system, which is to say the seed stocks and so forth and so on. And this has also undergone massive transformations over the last few decades, in which genetically engineered seed stocks increasingly are the lay of the land, not only in the United States, but around the world. And there's some worries about that, and there's a lot of money being made about that. And there's a lot of power in that. There's also the agricultural production itself. There's the processing, packaging, and distribution component. There's the preparation and consumption. And there's the end-of-life disposal of this system. And I want to talk briefly about some of these as we go through. First of all, the agricultural production. Just to give you a sense of this as a general audience, and I apologize if this is second nature to you already. Farmers account for less than 1% of our population, and the average age of farmers is skyrocketing. Basically, our main institutions in our society have dropped the ball on educating people as farmers, as gardeners, and as food people more generally. And we're right now at a 40-year high in the average age of farmers, which is another trend that is very worrying, particularly if our desire is to create sustainable systems, which requires a lot more labor, a lot more farmers, and so forth. And so, as a land-grant institution, we'll come back to that. Farms. 8% of all farms account for about 70% of agricultural production. In other words, there's a lot of very, very large farms. 19 cents of every dollar, 19% of the profits in food were enjoyed by the production component, by farmers. This is part of 19%. In 1975, it was 40%. This is part of the large kleptocracy process that has gone on in our society over the last 30, 40 years, sometimes in the name of globalization, sometimes in the name of other things. But the end result is that we have massive wealth concentration in this kind of corporate sector that has, in a sense, pillaged our regions and our locales from the profits that they had enjoyed as recently as 1975. Cut it by half. And so now you know where at least some of the CEO salaries come from. In land use, the conventional system, we have over a 5-year period recently between 97 and 2002, we lost 11 million acres of cropland. The kind of urbanization, the eating up of farmland and so forth continues at a rapid rate that, again, can't be really sustained if we're serious about feeding ourselves. Likewise with water, the groundwater withdrawal in almost all major agricultural regions exceeds its refilling, its reproduction. And so the way that we use water to grow things presently can't be sustained. Nutrient runoff from pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers is massive. The dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, for example, was 5,300 square miles. And that's all from the corn and soybean effluents and so forth, as well as factory farming that flows downstream. And also, agricultural activities responsible for 7% of total greenhouse gas emissions in the year 2005. Livestock are a major contributor. A 2006 UN report asserted that meat production, including for food produced for animal eating, accounted for 18% of all greenhouse gases produced. That's a lot. That's almost a fifth of the greenhouse gases. And again, we are thinking seriously about engaging ways to lower our greenhouse gas emissions, dial back the parts per million of the various greenhouse gases, and we are, and agriculture is certainly one part of that. Consumption patterns. In 2000, the U.S. food supply provided 3,800 calories per person a day. People consumed about 2,700. and that increased, again, from 1970 by 25%. So whoever's parents lived when they were in 1970 and they were 20, you guys are eating on the average of 25% more food than they did at that when they were your age or whatever, right? And whatever age they were. And again, Americans eat a couple hundred pounds of meat per person a year, up 22 pounds from 1970. I'm going to skip over a bunch of these facts, but one of the things I just want to say is that what these numbers mean about the sweets and the meat and the oil consumption that is the fare of fast food is that we have what people call a diabetes crisis on the horizon. It's actually here, but the trends are very scary. And what this means is that there would be a lot of individual sorrow in your generation from diabetes and all of the difficulties that that entail. However, there will also be a lot of social costs associated with that we all will help pay for. And so a memo to the healthcare revision, if we don't figure out a way to fix our food system, fixing our healthcare system is going to be extremely difficult. Life cycle impacts. I'm going to skip over this, except to say that there's a massive amount of energy that is used in conventional food systems. This gives you sort of, I'm not going to worry about the numbers here. I'm interested in the ratios just to kind of think about the production of the food takes about 20%. Transportation within this globalized food system is about 13.5%, processing, packaging, and household storage. About 25% of all the food that is purchased goes in the garbage. And most of that goes in the garbage after it's been in the refrigerator a long time. And so, again, that's kind of one of these leaks that we have just because it's a convenience. But it's a massive drain on our kind of net economy as well as our ecological systems more generally. And I'm just going to just show you this real briefly, this complicated sort of thing here. It's interesting if you sit with it a while. But the point that I want to show you is that in the total amount of agricultural activity, this much is for animals, for meat. And this much is for the other stuff we eat. And so you can see how much of the activities around meat production, which is growing rapidly around the world as we export the American way of life for everybody who deserves a break today. And that is, again, a kind of serious issue from the point of view of the food system and the ecological carrying capacity of our planet. And so you can see the food losses, the 25% of them kind of falling out of this and so forth. And I'm just going to sort of leave you with that unsatisfying overview of this thing, of this graph. But again, the kind of issue that I'm kind of thinking about when you step back and look at these disparate sites and segments and flows and graphs and processes, what's clear is that as a total system, the inherent trends are of a nature that are literally quite unsustainable. The people and institutions who built the system didn't really anticipate the harmful health and environmental outcomes, but the sum of the system is greater than its parts. It has a life of its own. And that life is overtaking the life that we are living. And the vastness of it, the length of the supply chain, and the anonymity of the system in certain respects predisposes it to surprises and unexpected outcomes, whether they are salmonella outbreaks in lettuce whose origins are in California but are felt all over the country, or any number of examples like that. The system is open to those kinds of things. We can continue to organize our food system in this manner for a while, but at some point, the trends inherent in the system will surpass the capacity to sustain itself. There are any number of places that it can break down, and some of those are already taking shape. But the gap in knowledge and experience of eaters, you and me and everyone else, is great and also important, making it difficult for people to make informed decisions about the food they eat and about the importance of the food system as an issue. And yet the system is enormously profitable for those hierarchically integrated corporations that control it. 3 beef processing corporations control 72% of the nation's beef packing capacity. 4 corporations control 84% of all the cereal that we produce. 5 corporations control 67% of the pesticide market, 25% of the seed market, and virtually 100% of the transgenic seed market. And so the point is that there's an enormous concentration of power over life. I mean, we're talking about life here, as well as profitability in this conventional system. And to conjure forth the novelist Daniel Quinn, he talks about this metaphor of the airplane. We're all flying in this airplane. We look out the window. We're still above the ground and we're flying. The airplane is stopped. We're sort of gliding downward. We've done, you can't tell if the plane is actually flying or if it's gliding and falling. And I'm not sure where we're at, but I like that image as a kind of metaphor for our conventional food system that has all of these trends that are moving it towards really a kind of critical unsustainability. And so that's a sort of general snapshot of this conventional food system that we are all part of. Our taste buds and our bodies are predominantly shaped by. I want to talk now about the kind of local sustainable food systems creation that's going on really all around the world. And there's a lot of interest in this. But before I do that, I want to sort of sketch a couple of things out. And this is what I call this context of uncertainty that we live in at a biophysical, resource, and socioeconomic level. And these are all uncertainties that you're well aware of, right? The biophysical changes of climate. We're carrying out the greatest experiment in human history, maybe, in the world's history on some level in which an intentionality is concerned, in which adding as much greenhouse gases to the atmosphere is setting into motion processes that are little understood and less controlled. And sort of where that ends up, how we talk about it, how we model it. We are just barely scratching the surface on that, and it's very difficult to get agreements on any of that, much less some kind of agreement on slowing it down at a sort of a rate that is meaningful because of the nature of our historical global development, in which certain parts of the world benefited greatly from putting lots of it up over the last century and a half, 2 centuries, and other parts of the world haven't and are catching up and wish to foreground development over conservation and this. And so it's an enormously complicated issue, but climate change is certainly one of those contexts of uncertainty in which our landscapes are literally migrating away from us as the climate changes. Another one is land use and abuse, with soil depletion, topsoil depletion, gobbling up of farmland for suburban development, and the super species that humans have become have been so successful that we're in some sense, creating this confrontation with ourselves. And the other one is this diabesity crisis that I mentioned earlier, which is spiking not only in the United States, but in Colombia, in China, in many parts of the world where urbanization has taken place, and this urban fast food diet has displaced traditional food systems, and the kind of sugar plus oil plus animal fat is kind of becoming the fare. And so this is happening all around the world. Another level is resource issues. You've probably heard of this discussion of peak oil, at the point at which basically we have used at least half of the oil that is available to us, and we go down the decline at the same time that we're expanding our use of oil. Well, projections are that likely we're going to have to dial back our energy use by some 80% over the next 50 years. What will that look like? Can we sort of do that through conservation, technology innovation, and so forth and so on? That is an issue, because oil has also, it's kind of a magical substance, because it's so concentrated and so plastic that we can use it in so many contexts. And it's really undergirded the kind of overshoot of population, of development, of all of these things, which if you took oil away at this point, what would we do? There would be massive chaos, crisis, starvation, etc., etc. 40% of all energy used in agriculture goes to fertilizers and pesticides. And so this is a real issue as peak oil comes online, how we will deal with this. And then the other issue I just want to mention in this is seed stock narrowing. Globalization has proved very interesting and productive for a lot of people, but it's also left a lot of things along the way. Languages, cultures, as well as seed stocks, because seed stocks are very intimate, culturally specific things which, if not tended, dissipate. And so we're losing seed stocks rapidly all around the world. And as climate changes take shape, this is something. And so the socioeconomic one, what will this post-overshoot society look like? How will we organize ourselves? There's really interesting books about around there. And how do we reorganize around various ways? And so these are the contexts of uncertainty that we face as we look at this conventional food system and wonder how we can transform it before the kinds of uneludible trends sort of overtake us. And these are really important baseline issues to consider, obviously, because this is the world in which whatever systems we create will be unfolding. So, sustainable food systems present. There's an enormous growth in organic foods and interest in eating organically and locally. That's been part of our society for a good many years now, and that's slowed down a little bit, but it's still rapidly sort of expanding people's interest in that. Proliferation of farmers markets, community-supported agriculture networks, in which direct marketing between farmers and eaters take shape to transact food that can be trusted as sort of, nutritional, good, equitable, etc. There are some institutional shifts toward local food procurements in educational, hospital, nursing homes, and so forth. Not a lot, but some movement towards that. There's a local foods movement in nearly every region around the country that is very robust and very active, and in many ways somewhat under the radar of sort of our main institutions. And what we're faced with in creating this sustainable food systems is a need to grow farmers, because as I said, the educational means of reproducing farmers has basically been abandoned by our country as we kind of fantasized that farmers were a vanishing species that we would kind of move into the future away from. But also, we need to figure out ways that we can build what some people call middle infrastructure. Sometimes I joke, this is the kind of, the processing and distribution plants that we sold to Mexico along with our trolley cars and so forth in the 50s and 60s when we thought we were going to do other things. And we're trying to figure out how to rebuild our middle infrastructure, our regional points at which food is aggregated and redistributed from farmers to eaters. And these are kinds of issues that are being wrestled with all around the country, and as people associated with the sustainable food movement are working. So I'm going to talk a little bit about principles of this sustainable food movement that people who I've engaged think about as they work to create these middle infrastructure and systems of exchange. We need to take the BTU exchange seriously. How do we build energy efficient models for creating food and redistributing food? This is something that we haven't really had to pay attention to in the whole history of our nation in the United States. Bill Cronin, who has written a number of books, one of which is called Changes in the Land, which looks at English people coming over to the then colonies and coming from cultures of scarcity in which they conserved their firewood and so forth and so on, and arriving here and all of a sudden building fires that were 5 times as big as they had in England. And that process got institutionalized in our systems. And so it's not a surprise that per unit of production, we use massively more energy than, say, Japan or Europe, countries that the US likes to compare itself to. And so in building these sustainable food systems, we have to think about that. Shortening food chains, in other words, growing things closer to where people eat them, goes a long way towards that, but there's other aspects of it. We have to frame and implement models that can be economic generators for farmers, whole communities, and regions. As I sketched out earlier, over a 40-year period, farmers have enjoyed halving the profits that they used to from 1970 to the present. This has depopulated communities and impoverished rural areas. This local sustainable foods movement represents a potential, an opportunity, but it must become one of the fundaments of redesigning these systems, that is partly at least based on equity. That the growers and so forth share some of the fruits of their labors in a more equitable way. We have to increase the cultural and varietal diversity in food with historical heirloom and traditional crops. One of the things that the industrial food system has done is narrowed the varieties that we eat, because it has to have food that ships over long distances, that doesn't spoil, that looks like the thing it's supposed to look like, a standard apple or tomato that's red or whatever, and it's not based on nutrition or taste or whatever. And as a result, we have had a profound narrowing of varieties, and this is related to that seed stock issue that I talked about. We have to build models that preserve biodiversity in agroecosystems. We have, people talk about the kind of sixth extinction that we're on the edge of, in which the activities of humans have basically reworked the ecosystems of the earth such that we are on the verge of a kind of cascading set of extinctions. Part of that is based in farming. How do we recreate sustainable systems that also are good for wildlife, which is not just a nostalgic issue, but really is part of the warp and woof of the world that allows us to live here? In other words, there's a utilitarian value to this. How do we create infrastructure to channel feedback loops for water, energy, and waste? How do we create systems that utilize biomimicry? In other words, modeled on nature. How do we think of this as industrial ecology in which there is no such thing as waste? And so forth. Again, these are things we haven't really paid any attention to until very recently. We need to study local and regional food sheds, regions around areas that are populated, to determine the capacity for areas to produce types and amounts of food. We don't know that. Right now, generally speaking, locales produce between 1% and 5% of the food that they consume. That's rather astounding. In most places, it's closer to 1%. We probably, in Duluth, can't produce 100% of our food, but we can produce 30, 50, 70, I don't know. But we have to map this out. We have to think about this process carefully, and we have to take steps to do that. We have to adopt appropriate regional agricultural practices, crop choices, work towards organic methods that wean ourselves off of this oil-centered inputs that agriculture is now based on. And in order to do that, this is not just a sort of issue of farmers or the supermarkets of the world, also known as Archer Daniels, Midland, Monsanto, and so forth. It must involve a cross-section of society that includes government, community organizations, planners, developments, architects, businesses, academics, and eaters. Because we all have stake in this process, and in order to kind of build the momentum, the buy-in, and so forth, we need to educate ourselves and participate in this reconstruction. We need to build soils. Food is an offshoot in sustainable agriculture of soil. And we have, in conventional systems, in a sense, flipped that. We've looked at soil as the theater upon which our food is growing. And as a result, we are losing massive amounts of topsoil all the time. I have some numbers here, but it's an astounding amount of topsoil, every year, which is a sense a fossil resource, in the sense that it's something between fossil resource and present resource, because it takes a long time to rebuild that. It's the product topsoil of hundreds, thousands, millions of years of animals and plants dying there, right? We have to integrate urban edge gardening and farming, these 5 methods for protecting urban edge farms and gardens. Like I said earlier, we have to build local food processing facilities, both larger scale and smaller ones that are available for use by independent farmers and processors. We have to reframe our food goals and approaches from fast, convenient, and cheap, which has been the goals of food in the United States since at least the 1970s, into towards food that is infused with what some people talk about as romance, memory, and trust. Romance for the key role that food plays in our bodies, families, and communities. Memory of food that is raised and packaged in healthy ways, and trust that links from farm to fork are fair and healthy. This is a lot of education. We have to educate ourselves and our citizenry at all levels regarding the skills needed for understanding food systems, choices, food growing, processing, and preparation. And we need to see food as a key durable good for locales and regions. We're undergoing a kind of Control-Alt-Delete in our economy right now, where we come off this kind of heyday of whatever it was, .com profits and virtual production and financial shenanigans and things that were profited that didn't really create anything. And I like Steve Ballmer, who's the CEO of Microsoft, who says, this is not just a blip. This is a fundamental reset that we're going through, in which, we have to rethink what production is and basically come to terms with what durable goods are. And food is a durable good. Food is, in many ways, among the most recession-proof activities that we could engage in. And we need to rethink that. We need to educate our politicians and our policymakers about this, because food has gotten short shrift. Farmers have long been seen as sort of nerdy people who are like we're moving away from by the general media and society, and you know, there's a kind of large educational process in place here that is already being undertaken, but there needs to be scalings up of this. So I'm going to skip over a couple of these models of thinking about this and talk just briefly about some developments in sustainable food systems along the lines that I was talking about. One of which that is the Cherry Capital Foods, which is a sort of standard corporation in Upper Michigan that has come into existence. It's a regional food distribution business. And it has grown like wildfire. And it's a really interesting model for a kind of corporate business that achieves some and many of the goals that are laid out by integrating farmers, by allowing value addedness to flow back to farmers, and so forth and so on. There's another even more interesting development taking shape in Cleveland, in which people are getting together, foundations, universities, hospitals, banks, and so forth, community leaders, and they've created this thing called the Evergreen Cooperative Development Fund. And what they're trying to do is create cooperatives. The first one that they've created is a laundry system that then will basically take the business of the hospitals and the universities and so forth and so on, but the workers own this, and so their stability and stake in this is much greater. They're also creating a kind, they're in the process of creating a food business there, a cooperative food business that wants to have 5 acres under greenhouse, producing 800,000 heads of lettuce a year, giving people meaningful work in inner city communities that feeds them, literally themselves, and the institutions around them. And what's interesting here, I think, among other things, is that the big players, the universities and the hospitals and the foundations and the banks, have come together to work on this as a means of revitalizing inner city Cleveland. And it is based on models in Spain that have been very successful. There's another one in Chicago, and I'm just picking these out. There's a lot of different ones where Cisco, which is the largest food processing or distribution company, it's about 14% of all the food that's trafficked to institutions and so forth is run through Cisco, but they have partnered with Chipotle and Chicago Public Schools and FamilyFarm.org and the Illinois Growers to source local foods. So this is an attempt to get sort of the standard system sourcing local foods and thereby helping farmers and their profits, but also getting good food into the system. And then in New England, where there's a food cooperative association, there's a number of co-ops all around New England, and they're getting together, they've been meeting to try to figure out if they can expand and create a cooperative region that produces a variety of cooperatives, again with the intent to revitalize economically and otherwise the regions in a way that allows the value-added profits that are usually trekked out into global corporations to stay within the communities. And so those are some of the developments. Food shed studies are taking place around the country. There's a couple of notable ones. This one is of Greater Philadelphia, where Philadelphia has committed to figuring out ways that they can throw themselves into sourcing as much food that they eat locally as possible. And it's a 2-year process that they've done this study that looks at all of the components, but also of the capacity of this region to really provide food for them. San Francisco has done one. That's another model, which again is similarly looking at the capacity of the region to grow the food that's eaten there. And it's a kind of sort of win-win situation. It's better food. The region is vitalized. There's community development that goes along with it. It's better for the ecological spaces, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm part of a number of things in the Northeast region and that are trying to think about how we can utilize some of these models in the Northeast to help that region. One of which is this summit to integrate all kinds of people across the spectrum into thinking about getting educated and having a voice in thinking about the food system they would want to leave their children. Food shed studies. We are engaged in a number of food shed studies that look at the capacity of our region to feed itself. To what extent, on what food levels can we do that? I'm working with a Green Jobs Planning Committee that engages politicians. It's funded by the Zeppa Foundation to bring together institutions and people to think about how we can do this and begin sort of building and rebuilding the food infrastructure of the Northeast, which is basically, again, like many regions, been left to atrophy for 40 years. Because we believed that the global food system was going to be the route that would increasingly feed us. Kiwis from New Zealand and tomatoes from Chile or whatever. And we're realizing that that's not going to be infinitely possible. And so I'm going to jump over a number of these kinds of things and just show you this thing, which I drew up to talk with local politicians and policymakers in the Superior Grown bioregion. And we're thinking about this in terms of counties both in Minnesota and Wisconsin because we all cohere roughly around similar, we're hanging around Lake Superior, put it that way. And there's about 681,000 people there. Using the Bureau of Labor, people spend about $2,500 average a year on food. So the total annual outlay on food in the Superior Grown bioregion is about $1.6 billion. The total amount of food that is consumed that we produce is about a little over 1%. What would the economic infusion that, if we up that by 10% for our region would bring? $170 million. That's a lot of money for this region. What if we did that by 20%, 30%? I know for a fact that we could get to 10%. I bet we could get to 30%. I bet we could get higher. If that money could be captured by local communities, that would be an amazing rural redevelopment. And also, there's something called the local multiplier effect. A dollar spent locally generates twice as much income for the local economy as compared with it being spent on goods trafficked by outside business. So when you go and buy something, say at Walmart, that dollar goes to outside profits and people. And when you purchase something from local businesses, it recirculates within the community and has a different effect. And so once you start adding all of this up, the kind of the economic revitalization dimensions are astounding. So what I've been talking about, how do we do this? One of the things that I like is the model in alternative energy production. You're probably aware that Governor Pawlenty sort of signed what's known as 25 by 25. This was basically a commitment by the state to create 25% of its energy production through alternative renewable means by 2025. What's interesting about this is it gets around the great political debates of our time, which is, should government be involved or should it not, and what's its role, and so forth and so on. Because what's happening here is government is being used to set the goal. In other words, to be the radar of the trends that are seriously important. But it's not sort of stepping into what should be done. It's letting the creativity of people and communities and businesses and so forth figure that out through a combination of incentives and invention and so forth and so on. And this is a bipartisan thing. Amy Klobuchar introduced that into the Senate to try to think about doing that within the United States more generally. But the point is that it would be an interesting model. It is an interesting model for the local foods movement, because if we could commit in Minnesota to say something like 20 by 25 or 10 by 25, 30 by 20, we don't know what that would be. We need the food shed studies. We need to create those to map that out, and then we can kind of plug the numbers into what's in the realm of the feasible. But we do need to set these goals that sort of project our future based upon the trends that we see happening. And this is one model. We're in a land-grant institution. Land-grant institutions were to teach such branches as learning as are related to ag and mechanical arts, promote liberal and practical education of industrial classes in the several pursuits and professions of life. There have been various iterations of the land-grant institutions. And what I call land-grant 1.0 was the original 1862 model where these were created. Land-grant 1.1 was the Moral Act of 1890 aimed at former Confederate states. Several of today's historically black colleges have their origins in that. Land-grant 2.0, 1887, established agricultural experiment stations in connection with land-grant institutions. Land-grant 2.1 of 1914 established the cooperative system. Land-grant 3.0 creates sea grant colleges for aquatic research. 3.1 urban grant for 3.2 space grant for space, and 3.3 creation of 1994 land grant colleges for Native Americans. And recently, land grant 3.4, the sun grant for research in sustainable energies. We need, and this is the land grant system around the country. It's everywhere. And it is the kind of sort of Jeffersonian ideal writ large that we create these public institutions, mostly, there's a couple private institutions associated with this, but that, are used to disseminate education that is relevant to the needs of the populace. We need a land grant 4.0 in sustainable ag. Can we lead? Can they lead? How can we make food this most intimate relationship with nature, that fodder which literally reproduces our bodies over and again throughout our lives? How do we make this broadly relevant? How can the skills of humanists, social scientists, natural scientists, and so forth be brought into the mix in order to shed light on the complexities of culture, history, and tradition, all of which must play a role in the food transformations ahead? Because food is multi-cross, inter, and non-disciplinary. As eaters, let's get to work. And I'm going to leave you with one thing. This is a quote by a favorite writer of mine, Walter Benjamin. The task of every generation is to wrest tradition away from a conformism that is about to engulf it. Thank you.